Hello, this is Wade Frazier. This is January 28th, 2026, 10:52 a.m. I'm going to continue with my oral history of posts I've been doing. Again, it's probably going to be oral history in the end of my life, but or at least my professional life. But this post will cover the time from the raid's aftermath in January of 1988 to Dennis Lee's arrest with a $1 million bail in June '88, a few weeks after he declined the CIA's $1 billion offer to fold the operation. In my prior post on this series, I mentioned the phone campaign to complain to the sheriff's department that some network did. I don't even know who it was, but somebody affiliated with Dennis, some right winger, probably. And thousands of phone calls came into the sheriff's department for complaining. Well, how to say it? Mr. Deputy's promised to get me copies of what they took. And the next morning, I realized that they were criminals, so I didn't expect them to honor such a thing. And the phone campaign probably guaranteed what happened next. So I called Mr. Deputy, and I said, "Hey, how about those copies that I was supposed to, you promised that I'd get?" And then he started showing who he really was to me. The first, again, this isn't far from the end of it, but he said, "Hey, thousands of phone calls are coming into our department about you guys. We're not happy about it. Oh, and our photocopier is broken. Yeah, I don't think our copier doesn't work today." And then he said, "You're lucky we didn't also take your computers." So they basically said they're lucky they didn't seize every scrap of information we had about our business. So anyway, so he refused to provide any copies. And as an accountant, I mean, my job was dealing in documentation. Most of my career has been spent crunching numbers, et cetera. But back then, you're running a business, a startup particularly, and those documents is what you have to work with to run your business, eventually make your books, et cetera. When Dennis hired me back in Seattle, I mean, I built financial statements. I built their books from checks, bank statements, invoices, customer contracts, and I used all that to create it. It took me a couple of months. But that's how you do it. In this case, I couldn't make books, right? They took everything. So I didn't have anything to work with. Yeah, we were high and dry. As from an accounting perspective, we simply couldn't do it. Yeah, imagine being an auto mechanic and the police seize all of your tools. Try to stay in business that way. You can't. So with all my records gone, it was tough. In fact, we had information on the computers they didn't seize. I mean, they got access and they copied everything off of it. So they got everything we had, but at least we still had records ourselves. And so we contacted all our customers to ask them to please send us whatever documentation they had on the sale, et cetera, because we had nothing. And we tried trying to reconstruct the records, or just find out who our customers were. I mean, we literally it was like finding out again who our customers were, what they paid, all this kind of stuff. Dennis knew that a death blow had been aimed at our company, and they weren't finished. Yeah, Dennis started scrambling. So how are we going to survive this? So he revived his company called United Community Services, which was back in the 70s. That was his original concept for this shared savings card to unite the consumer, the one that Pat Robertson became Dennis's partner with. And Dennis revived United Community Services and transferred everything from Conserve Financial Services to United Community Services and put it all in his wife Allison's name. So Dennis was no longer an owner, this kind of stuff. Probably of limited utility. And everybody knew Dennis, he was the prime mover. Without Dennis, we were dead in the water. And so this is something that The powers that be knew that. We started getting educated though on the civil law that we were rated under. So this sales assisted marketing plan law. Again, the so-called crime we committed was we didn't file a one-page form with the cursory information and pay $50. That was our crime. The law provided for a cure for inadvertent violations of the law, which included offering refunds to our customers. So Dennis began his cure tour. So he did in LA. In fact, I saw one of the shows in Los Angeles, but he went around the United States offering people their money back. They call it the cure tour. But how to say it? It was more about trying to get the troops fired up to keep going forward. And I mentioned in my previous video how Dennis attracted right-wingers. And so one day amongst the right wing getting rated like that, actually, it was a bad, it gave us more credibility, not less. Yeah, so I would say, unless they raid you, people don't know if you're in that crowd. If they raid you, it means you're really onto something. Yeah, that's the real world. And so, yeah, so it's kind of a badge of honor to be raided in that milieu. In anything like this, it's like, yeah, being raided becomes the territory. And a few people did take us up on the refund. A handful of people said, "Yeah, we'll take a refund." In fact, one of them who did, who I wrote the check to the guy, if there was anybody who was a plant from the sheriff's department, it was him. So, I will tell that at a later date. We eventually, so again, after Dennis was arrested and there was all this evidence entered discovery, we got to see a lot. That was, some of it was shocking, some of it was funny, some of it was disgusting. And one of the documents we saw was Mr. Deputy's investigative report on how he got on the case, his career-making case. How did he get on it? Well, they said that one day he got a call from a man who attended one of Dennis's little Saturday shows in our machine shop, and he said that it seemed that we were drugging him with the coffee and donuts that we provided to people that day. So he thought he was bedazzled by the caffeine and sugar. And so he felt like he was in a daze and wasn't sure what Dennis was selling. And so he called Mr. Deputy. And that was literally, Mr. Deputy said that's what got him going on this case, was some guy who felt he was drugged by coffee and donuts, who didn't buy anything, by the way. But this was what got it hot on the trail of his career-making case. What I do know for certain is that the global elites were involved. In fact, they were involved in Seattle, they were involved in Boston, and so they were definitely involved in Ventura. So I know there's a lot that went on behind the scenes that we will never know. And so Mr. Deputy's story is just sort of like this fairy tale that he told, because that's not the real story. But it's the one that is in the records, and just reading it, you're kind of laughing at it. This is what got him his career-making case, with some guy who thought he was drugged by coffee and donuts. And I mentioned before, we were in two buildings, and I was walking back and forth between the buildings all day long before the raid. Well, after the raid, I ran, and it was involuntary. Walking was wasting too much time, so I was running between the buildings. And working 70-hour weeks. This was my life. In fact, Wayne, my professor, Wayne, he actually came to my office one day evening trying to help me out. And he saw, and basically, I was so buried. And so my desk, probably not much bigger than the desk right now I'm working on, particularly with everything missing, I mean, everything taken, there was a lot to do. And so I had pieces of paper, I had piles of paper on my desk of the various tasks I had to tackle. And it was totally chaotic. And so I would have these neat stacks of all the tasks I would attack for the next day. By 10 a.m., it was all just trash because of all the chaos that came into my office. Yeah, I was drinking through a fire hose of all the things that was going on, trying to stay alive, trying to keep the organization, trying to help us survive. And my drinking problems probably accelerated then, probably. Yeah, so I think before the raid, I was probably not drinking a whole lot, but I was working a lot. But after the raid, my drinking problem with Boston began directly. Again, when I was forced to drink early in my career, it became a very bad mechanism for coping with stress. And so, yeah, and thank God I stopped. After about 6 weeks of that, I started going into a general physical collapse. Um, Actually, my youngest brother, actually worked in our shipping department for a little while. And years later, he said, I had dark circles under my eyes. My brother said I looked like a raccoon. And this was from just the awesome stress of those days. And that was my third stress collapse of my career so far. And I was, what was I, 29 years old. I'd already had three stress collapses. In fact, my dead roommate, the one who died probably from the COVID shot, gave him brain cancer. He quit after about 20 years of his career. He quit and taught high school math. And in fact, the last time that we had his last good day, actually, I was with him, my wife and his wife. We all got together, and she actually, and I didn't hear this until then, is that he quit being an accountant to survive his health. So I don't know what the stress problems were for him, but I'm sure they were big. And so, yeah, this is the stuff they don't tell you in school. So this was, yeah, extremely stressful career path that I was on. 60 and 70-hour weeks was just, this was normal. 60, 70-hour weeks was just, it was normal in my profession. Yeah, water profession. And this is really hard. As I was writing again the Substack post that accompanies this, and I was weeping for part of this, just remembering. It's like, yeah, it's not fun to remember this stuff. I do my best to make light of it, but it was not fun. And so we had hundreds of customers by that time, et cetera. And this is normal. In fact, there's a funny saying. I don't know if Will Rogers said the original one, but I've seen it on bumper stickers a long time ago. It was like, don't kick a man unless he's down. And so, and this is what I saw in Seattle. I saw it in Ventura, which was as we were reeling from the blows by the sheriff's department, many of our business associates and people involved with that's now their chance to strike. This is their chance to attack us. So, yeah, it was like, again, to steal the company or what. I mean, it was just, yeah, this was, again, more of my journey's primary lesson. So once we were getting under attack, then everybody else started to pile on. Not everybody else, but a substantial number. So this was our opportunity then. Yeah, this was, as I said before, particularly when it became free energy, it was like everybody turned into orcs lusting after the one ring. And so, oh, it was so ugly. It was so ugly. The things I saw were so ugly. That one guy, one of the kit buyers, decided he would. There's many ways to steal the company. So one guy was a kit buyer in LA, and he decided to set up a rival network, would just copy what we're doing and try to take all our customers. And that family in Boston, who bought Dennis's remaining inventory there in Seattle, who Dennis continually tried to rescue them, tried to pair them up with partners and stuff to bail them out. They fought Dennis the whole way. They treated Dennis like their wayward salesman, and that they knew better. And we got to, and Dennis was their only chance of digging out of their hole. He was the only chance they had, and they didn't understand that. And anyway, so this guy who set up a competing network, he needed a system, a showcase system, et cetera. So he contacted that family. And a few months earlier, Dennis said, hey, I need a few more. Can I get some panels from you guys? They said, oh, we can't spare those. So they couldn't spare any panels for Dennis. But what they sure could do is sell a system to this guy in Los Angeles and have the salesman, their son, come out and install the system right in our backyard by a guy trying to basically steal our company. Yeah. So anyway, without our knowledge, we just heard about this through the grapevine. What had happened, and so anyway, the son came into our office actually after he'd, I guess, installed their systems, and I don't know if he was begging for forgiveness, so he got found out. I don't know, but he didn't get much sympathy from me. I don't know if he got much from Dennis or not. Dennis eventually forgave him, but this was just so normal as I came to learn. Victor Fisher, he was only with us about 2 weeks when the raid happened. And Dennis, yeah, Fisher was on a gravy train. Dennis was paying him, I think, 1,000 a week. Yeah, that was kind of a standard back then. You pay 1,000 a week, and Dennis paid for the guy's hotel room. His son came aboard. Yeah, they were on this gravy train, and after he'd been there, so now we're talking a few weeks after the raid. I don't know, 2 weeks, a month, something like this. And I had, in fact, my investors, my friends and stuff. I actually remember, I think it was the same weekend. I went down to talk to some of my friends in Los Angeles, let them know what was going on. And I came back came back Sunday afternoon, and I get contacted about going to Fisher's hotel room and having a meeting with several of the people, Mr. Engineer, Mr. Researcher, stuff, and they're saying, "Oh, we have this big problem that we have to, we need to meet." Fisher's calling this meeting this big, potentially fatal problem that we have. And so I go over there, and all it was Fisher was making a sales pitch for some accounting software that he was a salesman for. Yeah, he said, "Oh, if you don't, my systems, if you build them, you need to have serial numbers and accounting and stuff. So you need to have an accounting system for my systems." When we were just beginning building the first prototype, it was like, and I kind of laughed it off. I said, "Guys, this is not important right now. We don't need to be thinking about accounting systems for some system that we might build someday." It was, and I didn't realize till much later that Fisher was actually a salesman for the software. So yeah, it was a sales opportunity for something we didn't need. Anyway, it was just what a waste of our time. And then the next morning, I come in and Allison berates me for some meeting that we held, and I was like, I don't know. It's like, I talked to Dennis about it. And I said, "This is what happened." Oh, anyway, so Fisher was being disruptive. Yeah, he was, and that was the only time he did something. But he was doing stuff just kind of. He was trying to wrangle the operation or something into his it was weird. And so Dennis started paying him to stay away. He said, "Stay out of Ventura County." So Dennis paid for him to have a hotel or something down in LA and say, just stay away from our office right now. We don't. We'll let you know if we need you, kind of thing. So in fact, Fisher later betrayed Dennis big time. That's more than once, and that's something that'll come later. So Dennis was on his cure tour, and again, he was scrambling. He was scrambling to avoid the death blow. And one day at home, so Bob the inventor, so Bob Vandermoss from Seattle, the inventor who I was the guy who helped put his equipment into Stan's barn there in Ellensburg, who I call him in Boston to try to get him involved again to help make up for what happened. And he's yelling at me about all the money he thinks he's owed. And then they did an extortion demand from us again that previous autumn, when Dennis was trying to get his sales guys involved again to make it up to him. And all they're doing is trying to settle scores and attack. And so Bob, I don't know how he got my phone number, but he calls me at home. And he calls me at home, I'm like on a Saturday or something. And he goes, "Wait, Dennis, he's fled the area. He's never coming back. You'll never see him again." It was like from outer space or something. I was like, I mean, I knew who Dennis was. Bob sure didn't. And it was a thing where I just said, "Bob, what are you calling about? Why are you trying to tell me this?" He didn't have a good answer for that. I don't know if he was trying to scare me. I don't know what Bob was trying to do. In fact, as will come out later, Bob was like in full vindictiveness mode and actually tried to testify against Dennis, but he had nothing to testify to. The prosecution didn't even want him because he had nothing to say. "Oh, I got paid $1,000 a week by Dennis for doing nothing, and then he rescued all my equipment into this barn." And I mean, that's all he had to say. So it was like, yeah. So Bob had nothing to complain about, other than he didn't make some billions of dollars that he thought he deserved. For technology, it actually wasn't even very innovative, really. The heat storage technology was not a big deal. It was sand in a metal box. That's all it was. So Uh, yeah, so his invented days are over though. So yeah, in fact, when back, so 4 years after we moved Bob's equipment into the barn, it was still there. In fact, when Stan died in 1990, as far as I know, it's still there. I don't know if Bob ever recovered or not. And Bob died a while after that. He didn't live much longer. He did maybe another 10 years. So anyway, there are all these people that were like tearing at us from all sides. So you should have been our allies, but they were being disruptive, or they were trying to steal it, attack us, all this kind of stuff. And this was, how to say it, I had heard about a bunch of it in Seattle. I was seeing, and I saw a bunch in Seattle, but I was really getting both barrels of it there in Ventura. And in Seattle, I mentioned it's called the inside outside job. And this is something, it's actually part of the playbook. So it's part of the organized suppression playbook. It's called the inside outside job. And what happens is that you infiltrate people on the inside, okay, and then you attack it from the outside with attorney generals and sheriffs, et cetera, the media, et cetera. And so when it's getting attacked from the outside, the people on the inside will incite a mutiny. That's what their job is, and they try to collapse the whole thing. So the inside outside job, and I'm sure it works a lot, the inside outside job. And Betsy and Bill Delp, the hitman from the Bonneville Crown administration, they try to pull an inside outside job in Seattle when Dennis was out of town, lured into being out of town by Betsy. And so they attempted to do that. Well, in Ventura, the inside outside job was pulled off by Mr. Deputy and friends and a guy named Ken Hodgel. And Ken Hodgel was a kit buyer. I think he bought his kit before the raid. And he looked and acted just like Mr. Rogers. He was, and I know that Bill Delp was very charismatic. Betsy looked like just, a public servant. They have looked down. So these psychopaths and sociopaths, they're good. They're good at what they do. And so, yeah, Delp, again, he slept with the women of Dennis's company and stuff, tried to get them to steal stuff for him, et cetera. So I'm sure he was very persuasive, as psychopaths are. Psychopaths can be very persuasive people. Ken was another one. And Ken was a kit buyer. Ken was a Mormon, which became relevant later, which I learned that he was working probably for the global elite when he did this. He came in, the kit buyer, and he looked and acted just like Mr. Rogers. I mean, literally, it was like he looked and acted just like Mr. Rogers. And he was once the largest potato grower on earth. And so anyway, when Dennis was scrambling, one of the things he did was he tried to decentralize from the Ventura operation so the organization would survive if it got taken out of Ventura. So he did this 10 national dealerships around the country. And we had tryouts, interviews for it next to the LA airport. People flew in for this. And this was now in probably February. That's probably February when this happened, like on a weekend. And Ken came to make his pitch for why he should get one. In fact, his presentation was so slick, came on like such a Boy Scout, that actually Allison, Dennis's wife, led a round of applause after this guy made his pitch. It was so slick. Yeah. It was the only applause anybody ever got, in that stuff. So anyway, he was slick. The slick presentation. So there's Ken as one of now the regional dealers, directors, whatever. And that was the position he got in so he could strike later, which will come. But again, Ken was actually a contract agent like Bill Delp was. In fact, Bill Delp and Ken, when you're contract agents, when you're done with your operation, you're on your own. You got to use your criminal skills to survive. And so Bill did that. Yeah, Bill ripped off his customers, and I've linked to this. I've written about Bill. And then Ken, he actually got busted in a Mormon scam. They were alleging they were the executors of $1 trillion trust, et cetera. And they stole like tens of millions of dollars, something like $100 million or something they stole from, or 40. I think it was $40 million that they actually stole from all these people in their big Mormon scam. And Ken went to prison for like 15 years. And so, in fact, Ken's still alive, I believe. And the only reason I name him is because once you go to prison, he was defanged enough. I didn't have to worry about any retribution that Ken might whip up because he was effectively defanged. But he got out of prison several years ago. Moved back to Idaho, I think. Very good at what he did. So the sheriff's department, for their part, when they stole, forget the stuff they stole right now, but the stuff they took as part of the search, all our records, etc. It was also all of our customers, all our customer file. And that's, in fact, that's what we were writing back to. We had a rudimentary database on our computers that told us at least who they were and their mailing address. So we actually did a mass mailing and asked them to send what they had from with their transaction with us, because we didn't have it anymore. And the sheriff's department had it, so they had the information that we didn't. And so they went through the list, and it was alphabetical because we started hearing from our customers. So the sheriff's department was calling all of our customers and trying to make them feel like victims, and trying to, again, they're trying to manufacture victims. They're trying to get people to feel like victims so they would join in the prosecution against our company. It's called manufacturing victims. So this is what they were trying to manufacture victims. Now, as I said before, Dennis was this right-wing lightning rod. And so a lot of these people were from the right wing, and they knew. So yeah, I don't know what the percentage was, but a lot of Dennis's customers were very hip to what was going on. And so, and very few of them lived in Ventura County or nearby, so they didn't have to worry about the wrath of the sheriff's deputies. And so a lot of them just told them where they could stick their investigation, And so, yeah, these customers were like, they regarded the sheriff's department as criminals. And so they were like, we're not going to cooperate with their so-called investigation. And the customers that were uncooperative, the sheriff's department would then threaten them. So they would be an accessory to the crime now. So our customers were criminals in the sheriff's eyes. Yeah, this is how this stuff works. Yeah, really Orwellian. Really, in fact, the sheriff himself. So some customers called in and said, actually, the sheriff himself was making those. Yeah, it was a big full court press. There were hundreds of customers to call. So even the sheriff of Ventura County got involved, calling customers to fish around for victim, manufacture them. In the end, they got 9, and I'll get into that later. 9 so-called victims, and only one really acted like a victim. And he is the guy I actually cut the check to give his money back, and he was a disgusting person to be around. And so this was something that, yeah, in fact, he was the one I think was maybe a plant. If it was a plant, it was him. And he's the only one, right? The other ones, they didn't act like, they didn't think they were victims either. And one of the guys got on the, I'll get to it later, one of the guys got on the witness stand, and he was confused as to why he was even there. And he actually, because he lived in nearby LA, and Mr. Deputy actually went to his house to try to convince him what a victim he was with his leading questions. And this guy was so offended, he asked Mr. Deputy to leave his premises because he was in LA County, not Ventura County. And when he was on the witness stand, and they said, "So why did you complain?" And he was like, he goes, "I didn't complain. I think Dennis is a saint." I didn't complain. That was one of the so-called victims. And so, yeah, he thought Mr. Deputy was scum of the earth, and Dennis was a saint, and he was supposedly one of the victims of Dennis. In fact, after that little performance, they crossed him off their list of witnesses. And that's how incompetent this all was on the prosecution side. That's how incompetent they were. Not including criminality and dishonesty, but they were incredibly incompetent. I also had some compensation in those days, though, which is, again, my otherworldly journey and some of my otherworldly friends, etc. And so about 6 weeks after the raid, I started going into a general physical collapse from the stress. I was a year of pretty much unending, stress. And at that moment, I got romantically involved with a woman who became my wife. And so this was, in fact, I pretty much lived like a monk my whole life until I met the woman who became my wife. And so we became romantically involved at the end of February 1988. Got married 2 years later. And again, back to my otherworldly friend, getting involved with her during my life's worst year. That was a coincidence that I don't dismiss it. I know that this was arranged by my otherworldly friends. And in fact, it ended up being the beginning of the end of my days with Dennis, really. So, yeah, so I was, my life took a different direction. Not immediately, but that's what ended up happening. And our relationship went through the ringer that year, right? So, yeah, and as I'll get to in these videos, you'll see what I went through. And I put my future wife through a lot, just witnessing what I was going through. Um, yeah, if our relationship could survive that, could survive anything. And people like me, Dennis, Brian and Larry, all of us, these people on a mission. We all had long suffering wives, and stuff. It wasn't easy to be married to people like us on special assignment. So yeah, not easy. So I guess I could never make it all up to my wife for being married to me. So and another bit of compensation was we'd only been together a few. So the middle of March, Wayne, and again, Wayne was this great white hunter. So he was a North Dakota farm boy and grew up hunting and fishing. This is America's pastime in the rural areas, hunting and fishing. And so he was a hunter and fisher, and I mean a big time hunter. And so back when he was rich, before he met us, he would go to Alaska a lot. He bagged moose, heck, grizzly bear. He had a grizzly bear pelt on his wall, all sorts of deer. In fact, in nearby Ventura County was like a preserve where you could go hunt stuff. Well, anyway, on the Channel Islands, the islands off the coast there, which were pretty much uninhabited. The Indians lived there, but once the white people showed up, those islands weren't inhabited very much. In fact, Santa Cruz Island, which is the biggest one, today it's all a national park, as I believe. At that time, there was about 10% of the island was set aside as a hunting preserve. And Dennis, being the great hunter, he knew the guys. So he knew the guys who ran this hunting preserve on the south end of the island. And anyway, one weekend he flew me out there, and this is in March. And in March is Southern California's most beautiful. I mean, the it looked like Ireland, so that it was all rolling grass, etc. And on that hunting preserve, they hunted sheep and pigs, like wild sheep with their tails are this long. They weren't trimmed off like you normally see sheep, and wild pigs. And so anyway, I spent the weekend there with Wayne. The only time I was ever in a helicopter. Back on the way out to the island, there was migrating gray whales down there in the ocean with the pods of dolphins following them, and we actually hovered over them a bit. And then there was a whale watching boat that was going behind them, and we didn't get down too close because Wayne said that if we got too close, the whales would sound. That wouldn't make the whale watchers very happy. So, but that was amazing. And then we flew out by plane. Yeah, that was a fairy tale weekend. So I had this fairy tale weekend that was sandwiched into this nightmare. So anyway, it was amazing. And by April, well, I was wiped out. By April, yeah, was it 3 months in or so of 70-hour weeks. Yeah, I had been collapsing for a while by that time, and I asked Dennis for the summer off. I said, "Can I have the summer off to recover?" And by that time, Dennis said, I had saved his bacon so many times by then and I said, "Whatever you want, Wade." And so I was going to spend the summer hiking in the Cascades with my cousin, recovering. And quite honestly, I didn't know if I could go in an environment like that again. I was like going into a war zone. That was a total nightmare. So I planned to spend the summer hiking in the Cascades with my cousin. So I gradually tailed off my involvement in Dennis. By May, I was only coming in sporadically. And Dennis hired my replacement, who I never met, but he hired a guy to replace me as a controller. And as I mentioned, we were a Mecca, right? Before the raid and after the raid, we were still a Mecca. In fact, maybe even more prominent Mecca after the raid, because I said in these circles, it was like we became heroic after the raid because they knew that only the heroes would get raided. And I'm going to tell a few more anecdotes from people who came to tell us their stories. They came to tell us stuff. And in fact, as I was no longer working as much, I was out in the parking lot more and talking more with the people who showed up. And again, people were showing up from all over the world to talk to us, this kind of. And so, I can't remember too much about my alternative medicine journey. Before my days of study. I mean, at 12 years old, we went to Whole Food. I became a vegetarian when I was 20. I fasted, all this kind of stuff. And then Wayne actually is his wife. She had serious chemical allergies. And so she got into alternatives because Orthodox medicine couldn't do anything for her. So she started getting, and in fact, she's 80, well, she's 80, God, 87. She's 80, maybe 87 now and going strong. Um, but but in fact, Ventura with its pesticides, with a lot of agriculture there, incapacitated her. So she started getting into alternative medicine. And I probably talked to her about some of that. In fact, I'm sure I did. In fact, maybe around this time. And so I was, again, I'm trying to remember. I don't think I was that hip to alternative medicine. Pretty hip, but you know, I did a lot more study 1990 and afterwards. But I remember there was a couple of elderly gentlemen who were Eastern Europeans. And we had a lot of non-Americans coming. And anyway, these Eastern Europeans, and mostly these guys were immigrants, though. And so a couple of elderly gentlemen from Eastern Europe were talking with me one day. And I somehow mentioned that, the big pharma, the medical racket, they murder people. And so alternative practitioners and stuff would get murdered by the medical racketeers. They have assassination teams, et cetera. And when I said that, these two guys, their eyes lit up and they go, "Wow, we were at one of those." And so Max Gerson. So Max Gerson was one of the pioneers of alternative cancer treatments. In fact, back in the 40s, he actually had cured cancer patients on the floor of Congress. They're trying to get laws passed to allow alternative treatments, non-toxic, cheap, they work. All outlawed. In this country, it's all outlawed. That's how the medical racket operates. And so, but that's not enough. And so Gerson actually had conferences, he's trying to get a movement going for alternative health. And these gentlemen were there at one of the conferences when Gerson was poisoned with arsenic. And I read about it years later. So they were there. They said they were actually there when Gerson was poisoned with arsenic. And the conference was over as soon as he got poisoned. But he got poisoned a couple times. And in fact, almost died. And then they found arsenic in his urine. So yeah, he was poisoned. And this is the medical racketeers. They have assassins who will poison you, etc. And so yeah, this is how it works. So so it was interesting to hear those guys talk about that. And years later, I read about how Max Gerson was poisoned. Well, those guys were there for one of them. Years later, Brian O'Leary, so my astronaut colleague, who was ahead of me on some of this stuff when we eventually traded notes, etc. And Brian said that the medical racketeers were actually more vicious than the energy racketeers, more violent, etc. And I don't doubt that. And my guess is that the deepest pockets in the world are the people who run the energy racket. Again, it's all interlocks at the top, but the energy racket's the big one. Energy is the big one. And this is what my work is trying to help educate people on. It's like the energy issue is it. Everything else is secondary. The energy racket, so again, they know that if free energy and related technologies got out, it'd be the end of elites, it'd be the end of their rule, et cetera. And so that's the big one they're always protecting from. And their pockets are so deep. Again, they're the hundreds of billions of dollars they pay out in quiet money, et cetera. They can do that. The medical racket, I've heard of medical racketeers trying to buy people. They're trying to buy stuff out to actually monopolize it, not really to bury it. But again, it was capitalism at its finest. And so, but the medical racketeers usually just go to the stick. So the energy racketeers have carrots and sticks, which as I lived through. But the medical racket, they often don't even bother with the carrot, that's straight to the stick. And murdering people, they do that. So they actually would murder people. Probably more common though is they get, doctors get their licenses stripped or revoked, kidnapped, put into prison, all these kinds of things, threatened with lobotomies, all this. And I've written about this a lot. And so, yeah, super gangster activity by the medical racket. So the energy racket's a little more sophisticated, I guess, a little more, I said they might pay you $10 million to go away instead of just kill you. So, and again, I think it's just, how to say it, it's just expedient for them. So they can't really afford to kill 10,000 inventors. So it'll attract too much attention. So yeah, they use violence. They do kill people, but it's usually a last resort, not the first. But the medical racket, they seem to go to stick pretty quickly. I remember a minister from New Zealand. So a guy from New Zealand showed up who was a minister, and he said that, and he was giving, and he actually talked about some skullduggery happening in New Zealand on basically stealing land from the Maoris. Imagine that. And he said that he said, no nation on earth is free of this stuff. Yeah, there's no place you can run and hide or go where there's all the good people and this kind of stuff doesn't happen. He goes, it happens everywhere. And that was one of the early first times I'd actually heard that. It's like, yeah, you can't do that. And over the years, many times people go, oh, wait, I know what country you can go to where you could do this, free of being molested. Wrong. And so it's, yeah, there's nowhere to run and hide. And so, in fact, any successful effort has to do it in the light of day. That's been my attitude for a long time. In fact, I've always hated the secrecy. Dennis and Allison would do stuff like, we're gonna, do some, we're gonna sneak by these guys, or, it's like, and I didn't say it at the time, but I knew that if we had to resort to that, we were dead. I mean, it's like we wouldn't succeed if we had to resort to trying to play secrecy games. Yeah, it's yeah. An effort's not going to work just doing that, in my opinion. It has to be done. That's why, again, any free energy effort has to open source the technology. It's going to be successful. It has to open source it and give it away. It can't be about secrecy and the capitalist kill and all this kind of stuff. None of that works. In my opinion, none of that will work. Dennis was the best at trying that angle, and I saw the best of the best try it, and I want to come close to that again. Another man, another immigrant from Europe, came, and he was a constitutionalist. And actually, he challenged the IRS's ability to levy and collect taxes, because according to the Constitution, only Congress is empowered to levy and collect taxes. And he actually went to court with the IRS over not paying his taxes, and he cited the Constitution, and the case was dismissed. So yes, we won. He won against the IRS over their ability to actually do what they do. And I read, and again, a lot of the right-wing literature, I read this stuff, and here was a guy who actually prevailed in the courtroom. So those are some of the stories that come to mind as I think about. There are others, but those are the ones that are, I remember those ones quite well. And by May, I was pretty much leaving the operation. I was coming in sporadically. Yeah, I was so worn out. And Dennis, so here comes kind of one of the big events. So Dennis, and as I discussed earlier, when I became Dennis's partner, he didn't tell me that I was getting a 98% discount over the investor who backed out. And, and he was, I would say, that was benefiting me, I would say, right? Not hearing that, Dennis decided I didn't need to hear the other guy was going to put up $1 million. And in fact, he never told me. I read all his books that this guy was going to put up $1 million before he got cold feet. Yeah, 20,000 was a down payment. And I only found out when I read one of Dennis's books while we moved to Ventura, so he could work with my mentor. They didn't tell me that. So I found out in one of Dennis's books. So here's another event that I didn't know about till I read it in one of Dennis's books. And by that time, I was sort of not in the operation any longer. So I get it why I didn't hear about it. And even if I had been involved, would I have heard from Dennis this? I don't know, maybe. But when I was on my way out like that, I totally understand why Dennis didn't tell me about it. But what happened was in May, Dennis got a call from some bankers in Chicago. Some bankers in Chicago said, Dennis, come on out. We want to talk to you. So Dennis, being Dennis, he goes out and meets these bankers. Well, it was really about meeting this guy from the CIA. And so again, CIA, these kind of guys are, they got gold cufflinks or Ivy Leaguers, etc. They're very witty and urbane. And these are old money kind of guys. And so Dennis goes to there and he meets with the CIA guy. And the CIA guy proceeded to tell Dennis that he was representing European interests. Basically, he said, here, we want to make an offer. And the offer is, we're going to write a check to you, and we'll put the 1 on it, and you put the zeros on it to fold your operation. Yeah. So we want to buy you out. And so you're done. And again, the previous year, we got the $10 million offer from the global, which I didn't learn that for many years later. But what I did learn eventually, I saw this repeatedly, is that they increased the offer by 100 times. This is one of their go-to moves. Yeah, these people are used to getting what they want. And so if $10 million isn't good, no, how about $1 billion? So yeah, Dennis could have asked for $1 billion and they would have paid it. But we'd have been done. Yeah, I certainly wouldn't be doing anything like this. And my piece of that would have been, I don't know, 50 million, 100 million, some crazy number like that would have been my cut of it. And Dennis being Dennis said, that's a very interesting offer. I think I'm going to take that offer with one little negotiated term, a caveat here, which is you put the 1 on the check, I put the zeros on it, and it goes back in their pockets and it's earmarked for bringing free energy to the world. How about that? You guys can have all the glory, all the credit, all the money, but you guys bring free energy to the world. How about that? Use that money to do that. And the CI guy was shocked. He was like, choked on his soup, and he said, he was just an errand boy for the global elite. So he said he wasn't empowered to accept that counteroffer. And then that was the end of their meeting. So Dennis goes back to Ventura, and the CIA man goes back to wherever he goes to. And a couple of weeks later, he called Dennis and said, "Dennis, I'm going to be in town, and I want to take you to dinner." So Dennis did. So the guy took him to dinner. Again, this was just a couple weeks later. And Dennis said the offer never came up. And it was just, a nice dinner with Dennis. And later on, so like the next year, actually, as I'm reading Gary Wien's book, he didn't call it the kiss of death, but it was something similar to that. And what Gary said was that he saw this where, again, the corrupt judges and officials, et cetera, and these gangsters, they have a target, somebody they're going to kill, and they decide they're going to kill him. And what they do, though, is that before they kill him, they actually give him a party, and they treat him like the long lost son. It's all this this is they sort of they throw a party for him, et cetera, before they kill him. And anyway, I've seen this over and over now, and it's just and I don't know if it's sadism. If while they're at the party and this guy's having a good old time, they're saving up their memories for when they do kill him, or if it's actually some kind of sympathy for the guy to have one last, nice moment before they kill him, or maybe it's to give them plausible deniability. Hey, we gave him a party last week. Why would we be the guys to kill him? I don't know. So I don't know what the exact rationale is behind this, but I've heard about this strategy repeatedly. And so it's a thing of, I don't know. My guess is that CIA guy, when he came there, he was actually arranging for Dennis's treatment. And so instead of paying $1 billion to make Dennis go away, just pay 10 million under the table to a bunch of corrupt officials and let them take care of the problem. I think that's what happened. I'm pretty sure that's what happened. And so, so he was out there, taking Dennis some dinner and stuff while he's paying some of the officials under the table to take us out. That's my guess. And others have been dangled $1 billion. Stan Meyer, Stephen Greer was dangled $2 billion. Again, the global elite faction told Greer, over 30 years ago, they paid $100 billion in buyouts by then. Dennis was certainly a 1% problem. And I've run into an amazing amount of denial and naivete around this. Dabblers, newcomers to the field and stuff, and they just go, well, I never heard of, and people have heard of the buyouts, but they go, well, $1 billion, my God, I've heard no inventor's ever gotten that. Well, of course no inventor ever got that. Dennis wasn't an inventor, so Dennis was leading a movement. And I would hear this repeatedly from people who are really naive. dabblers, newcomers to the field, and they couldn't distinguish between a guy in his garage with a 100-mile-an-hour carburetor and a guy who's leading a national effort who has survived all attempts to kill him so far. So it's a thing where a little bit of difference between those two. And so anyway, yeah, so Stan Meyer apparently was offered $1 billion on Arab Sheik. Steve Greer was dangled $2 billion. And again, they told Greer they paid out $100 billion in quiet money. And nobody ever did before or since what Dennis did. So what we were doing was unprecedented. And so, yeah, we were definitely a 5-alarm fire for the global warming, particularly with people like my mentor in the stable, et cetera. Yeah. In fact, as I learned later, it was more than that. So down the road was Sparky Sweet, his free energy machine, et cetera. Yeah, the biggest threat that Dennis really posed, well, it wasn't best heat pump in the world and best heat engine, even though they could do free energy. It was that Dennis knew how to bring pigs to market. And so he could have brought Sparky's pig to market. I believe that's what scared the global elites. That's why they were offering Dennis $1 billion to go away, because they knew that Dennis could make stuff happen. And nobody else could. And nobody else has ever been able taking a disruptive technology to market, et cetera. Dennis was the guy. And so this is what they were trying to end, was the threat of Dennis bringing somebody's disruptive energy technology to market. And free energy would be their biggest nightmare of all. So this is what I believe was going on. And so in June, I spent a couple of weeks visiting friends in LA, like I did in '86 when I chased Dennis out to Boston. I spent a couple of weeks in LA seeing friends, seeing my family, et cetera. And so I did the same thing in '88. I saw a bunch of friends in LA before I took off for the summer up in Seattle. And so I spent a couple of weeks seeing friends beginning early June. And just before I was going to leave, so this is in June 23rd or 4th or something like that. 5th, somewhere in there, I got a call from Allison, who told me Dennis had been arrested. And so this is literally, it's like the day before I was going to leave town. So she said Dennis was arrested. And Dennis, again, I live with Dennis and his wife and his children there. Again, a couple of miles from where I was lived, only a few blocks from the sheriff's department and the jail. Our office was only, again, less than a mile from the jail. It was all right there. We're right in their backyard. They could have arrested Dennis at any time, at his home, at our office. But Mr. Deputy, he was in show business. So what he did was he orchestrated a spectacular arrest and media splash in Los Angeles, capped off with $1 million bail as if he had arrested the criminal of the century. In fact, one of my friends, one of the only friends that was really supporting me in Ventura, he called me one night. And he said that he's watched the TV news and there's a segment on Dennis. And what had happened was Mr. Deputy took Dennis's tapes, all of his tapes, and they edited all this creative editing and stuff, make it look like Dennis the con man of the century. And then again, this is the stuff that I learned through Ed Herman eventually, right? Where downsized media departments would get a propaganda tape from some corporation. They just play it unedited, and they'd pass it off as, investigative reporting or something. He did that. And so he presented this tape to the LA TV stations and they just played it. And so it was all over all over the LA news, this big media splash. And it was the crime of the century had been solved, this kind of thing. High theater. I was still gonna, I was in no shape to really help. I had to try to get well. And so, but I went to the first hearing after, so that I think the day after Dennis was arrested, I went to the hearing, and it was about the $1 million bail. So the $1 million bail was higher than, it was astronomical for the time, higher than anybody in the whole county, people in for murder, et cetera. Dennis's bail was higher than that. Now, again, what Dennis eventually spent 2 years in prison for was actually not filing a form and paying $50 for a civil law. Even in Ventura County, I don't think they could have made $1 million bail stick for a civil law violation inadvertent. And so in fact, this whole thing of trying to manufacture victims. So these 9 victims, so-called victims, were used for his fraud charges. So that's the only way he can make $1 million bail stick, is also prosecute Dennis for fraud, which was totally bogus. But it stuck. So these fraud charges, which eventually dismissed. But anyway, so these fraud charges was how they could stick the $1 million bail. And that first hearing, in fact, the year 2 years earlier, I mentioned I was in federal court in Seattle on the bankruptcy hearing as I watched all these groups fight over the carcass of Dennis's company. And I think this was the second time I'd actually been in a courtroom. So I'm in the courtroom back in the public scene. There were a lot of people there. And again, it was about Dennis's, the $1 million bail and seeing if that might get adjusted. Perhaps again, but again, it doesn't wipe out the whole thing. So I'll keep going here. So, where was I with that? Dennis actually, there was an attorney, a local attorney who had been, he had a reputation for he stood up to the officials, etc. It was mostly for show. He wasn't quite as vigorous a defender as his reputation was, but he had the reputation. So Dennis, we hired him. Allison hired him to be Dennis's defense counsel. And so at this first hearing, I think he was there, and it was, how can we reduce the bail to something reasonable so Dennis can get out of jail? And again, it was astronomical. It was astronomical bail. And, as I was watching the show. And so Dennis's attorney made his arguments for why it should be reduced to something way lower. In fact, the bail schedule for Dennis's offense was $5,000. And Mr. Deputy raised it to $1 million, which the judge rubber stamped. And Mr. Deputy, as we'll get to later, he cited his vast experience in fraud investigations for why his professional judgment should be used to give $1 million bail for Dennis. So they were going to try to make sure Dennis never saw the side of the bars again. That was what they were going for. And they don't hesitate to murder people either. So as I will get to. So Dennis's attorney made his cases, and then a woman who I call Miss Prosecutor, it's the first time I've seen her, and she was the assistant district attorney, and she led the prosecution, and she had the look down. She had the she looked like Legal Beagles, Robert Redford, and I can't remember the woman's name now. She was in Terms of Endearment. Whatever her name was, but she had this look down, the woman attorney, with her nice dress, etc. And she got up, brunette, and she stood up, and in 1 minute, she told several big lies. It was like lies. These are just total lies that she's telling to the judge why the $1 million jail is justified. And I remember my shock. I remember it was just lie after lie after lie after lie, like in 1 minute. And she was almost shrieking hysterically about how Dennis was this evil, like it was some mass murder or something, like Hannibal Lecter or something. It was totally insane. That she was almost shrieking about how Dennis should have been locked up forever, kind of thing. And I'll be talking about her a bit in the future videos. So anyway, it was really stunning for me. And again, more of my education on how the world really works. Watching her lie. Again, it was several. It was like 6 or 7 big lies in 1 minute. Yeah, every 10 seconds there was another lie. And anyway, so the judge, he listened to the argument. He said, okay, how about 750? So 750,000, only 250 times more than the bail schedule called for. So this was no, not 250. What is that? 750 divided by 5, 150. What is that? So that's 30 times. Is that right? Only 30 times the bail schedule? No. I put this on hold while I calculate that. Okay. This old accountant ran the numbers. It was 150 times what the bail schedule called for. So that's how Ventura County. I was learning this is how it operated. The county I was raised in, etc. I was learning this is how it really works in my good old hometown, my good old home county. So after that spectacle, I drove to Seattle to try to get well. So a lot more is coming. So that's all for now.